My name is Adam, I'm 40, and for 15 years, I believed I was living the perfect suburban dream with a fiercely loyal wife. It was all a beautifully orchestrated lie. On an ordinary Tuesday in our warm kitchen, my wife, Sarah, left her iPad on the counter. That single, glowing notification from a contact named M triggered an irreversible chain reaction that changed everything. What lay behind that screen? A booked luxury suite, a hidden camera feed, and a positive pregnancy test. In just 48 hours, my life imploded into a catastrophic criminal nightmare. And the keeper of this dark secret? Sarah herself, who walked back in humming a tune, gently rinsing fresh basil for dinner, completely oblivious that her world was about to burn. Before we get into this, please take a moment to like and subscribe. But only if this story truly resonates with you. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I want to know where you are right now. The kitchen smelled of roasted garlic and rosemary chicken, the kind of heavy, comforting aroma that usually made our house feel like an impenetrable fortress against the outside world. I stood by the stove, slowly stirring the rich marinara sauce, watching the steam rise and disappear into the warm glow of the pendant lights overhead. At the kitchen island, our 12-year-old daughter, Maya, sat with her chin resting in her palm, chewing on the eraser of her pencil as she stared down at a page of pre-algebra homework that seemed to baffle her. Every few minutes, she would let out a dramatic sigh, looking up at me for a hint, and I would smile, offering a gentle nudge in the right direction without giving away the answer. It was a perfect, ordinary Tuesday evening, the kind of quiet domestic scene we had played out hundreds of times before in our comfortable suburban home just outside of Cherry Hill, New Jersey. The neighborhood was quiet, the lawns were always perfectly manicured, and the life we had built here over the last 15 years felt solid, stable, and entirely safe. Then I heard the soft, familiar rhythm of footsteps coming down the stairs. Sarah walked into the kitchen, and as always, she seemed to bring a natural brightness into the room. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a loose, casual ponytail, and her gray eyes held a soft warmth that still made my heart skip a beat, even after all these years. She wore a simple cream-colored sweater that clung gently to her frame, smelling faintly of the mint tea she had been drinking upstairs. She walked over to where I stood, wrapping her arms around my waist from behind and pressing her face against my shoulder. I leaned back into her touch, feeling a profound sense of gratitude for the life we shared. She kissed my cheek, her lips cool and soft, before stepping back and reaching for her car keys on the counter. She mentioned she needed to run a quick errand to the grocery store down the street to grab some fresh basil for the salad and some milk for the morning. I told her to drive safely, watching her walk out the door and listening to the sound of her car engine starting up in the driveway before fading into the distance. The house fell back into its quiet rhythm. I turned my attention back to the simmering sauce, but as I reached for a spoon, my eyes caught a faint glow on the granite countertop. Sarah had left her iPad lying flat next to the fruit bowl. Usually, I would not have thought twice about it, but the screen had just lit up with a new notification. I stepped closer, intending to simply swipe the message away so the battery wouldn't drain, but my eyes locked onto the text preview appearing on the lock screen. The message was from a contact saved only as the single letter M. The words on the screen read that the suite at the Ritz was booked for next weekend, followed by a sentence saying they could not wait to taste her again. I stood frozen, the wooden spoon slipping from my fingers and clattering onto the stove top, leaving a bright red smear of marinara across the clean white ceramic. My breath caught in my throat, and the warm, peaceful kitchen suddenly felt entirely devoid of air. The comfortable heat of the room vanished, replaced by a sickening, icy chill that started in the pit of my stomach and spread rapidly through my limbs. I stared at the screen until it went dark, the reflection of my own pale, shocked face staring back at me from the black glass. Maya said something from the island, her voice sounding distant and muffled, as if she were speaking to me from underwater. I could not answer her. The world had tilted violently on its axis, and in the span of a single second, the entire foundation of my 15-year marriage had crumbled into dust. I did not confront her that night when she returned from the grocery store with the fresh basil, smiling and chatting as if our world were still perfectly intact. Instead, I let the white-hot anger crystallize into a cold, calculating resolve, eventually seeking out the one person who shared my agony, Clara, the elegant, betrayed wife of the man named Marcus. Over the next 4 weeks, Clara and I met in secret, hiding in the shadows of quiet diners on the edge of town and within the sterile, quiet comfort of her spacious living room, meticulously building our case. We were like two ghosts bound by a shared trauma, trading pieces of evidence like currency while the rest of the world went about its business. Clara had hired a private investigator who was thorough to the point of cruelty, and she eventually gave me access to the live feed from a hidden camera the investigator had managed to plant in the dingy, off-brand motel room Marcus kept for their afternoon trysts. It was a sordid, windowless space with faded wallpaper, and watching it felt like looking directly into a portal to my own damnation. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, as I sat beside Clara on her green velvet sofa, the screen of her laptop flickered to life. We watched in absolute silence as Sarah and Marcus entered the frame, but the usual frantic, desperate passion of their arrivals was entirely absent. Sarah looked pale, her shoulders hunched with an intense, visible anxiety that made her look smaller than she was. She paced the small room, twisting her wedding ring around her finger, before reaching into her designer handbag and pulling out a small plastic stick. She handed it to Marcus, and even through the grainy, low-resolution footage, I watched his face drain of color as he stared down at the double pink lines. She was pregnant. A sudden, violent thrill of dark triumph surged through my veins, instantly followed by a chilling wave of dread. The silent sabotage I had executed weeks earlier, when I had discovered her hidden stash of protection in her overnight bag and systematically punctured every single condom with a sewing needle, had worked perfectly. She had fallen directly into the trap, believing her secret was safe behind the illusion of safety we had both played into. Clara and I sat in the quiet room for a long time, the silence broken only by the steady hum of the laptop fan. We knew we had them trapped. We spent the rest of the afternoon finalizing our strategy, gathering the joint financial records, the photographic evidence of their meetings, and the precise medical timelines that would leave them with absolutely nothing. We had enough ammunition to strip them of their dignity, their assets, and everything they valued. When I finally returned home late that night, the house was dark and quiet, the children already asleep upstairs. I walked into the kitchen and found Sarah sitting alone at the wooden table, a single dim light casting long, distorted shadows across her face. She was staring blankly at the opposite wall, her expression completely hollow, while her right hand rested gently, almost unconsciously, over her flat stomach. She looked up at me as I entered, her eyes filled with a cold, distant detachment that made her look like a total stranger. I offered a quiet, polite nod, masking the roaring satisfaction in my chest, knowing that she was completely unaware that the storm was about to break and ruin her life forever. Chapter 3. The rain began as a soft, persistent drizzle on Saturday night, but by Sunday afternoon, it had transformed into a relentless, gray sheet of water that blurred the neat lawns and asphalt driveways of our quiet Cherry Hill neighborhood. The sky was the color of wet slate, hanging low and heavy over the rooftops, casting a somber, dim light through our high living room windows. It was the kind of day that kept everyone indoors, seeking warmth and artificial light, but inside our house, the atmosphere was thick with a suffocating, silent tension. Earlier that morning, I had dropped Maya and her younger brother off at their grandparents' house for a planned overnight stay. I remembered the way Maya had hugged me goodbye, her bright, innocent laughter ringing out in the driveway before she ran inside, completely oblivious to the rot that had taken hold of her family. Driving back alone, the silence in my truck had been deafening, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside my own head. I knew that today was the day the facade would finally shatter. There was no more waiting, no more gathering of evidence, and no more quiet observation. The trap was fully set, and all that remained was to spring it. I stood in the hallway, listening to the rhythmic, metallic ticking of the grandfather clock that had belonged to my father. It was a sound that usually brought me comfort, a steady reminder of the passage of time, but today it felt like a countdown. In my jacket pocket, my fingers brushed against the heavy manila folder Clara had given me, its cardboard edges slightly bent from the grip of my sweating palms. Inside that folder lay the absolute, undeniable proof of my wife's betrayal, dozens of high-resolution photographs, financial spreadsheets documenting secret hotel stays, and transcripts of messages that made my stomach churn every time I pictured them. But it was the other item in my pocket that felt the heaviest. My thumb grazed the tiny, sharp point of the silver sewing needle I had carried with me for weeks. It was a ridiculously small object, yet it had been the instrument of a massive, irreversible shift in our lives. It was the tool of my quiet, desperate revenge, and its consequences were now growing inside Sarah's body. I walked slowly into the living room, my footsteps silent on the thick, cream-colored carpet. Sarah was sitting on the edge of the matching sofa, wrapped in a gray cashmere cardigan that she often wore when she felt chilled. The television was on, playing some mindless home renovation show on mute, the flickering blue light dancing across her pale, drawn face. She had a mug of herbal tea cradled in both hands, but she wasn't drinking it. She was simply staring through the steam, her gaze fixed on some invisible point on the floor. Her right hand occasionally drifted down to rest against her stomach, a subtle, protective gesture that she seemed to perform without even realizing it. Watching her, I felt a complex wave of emotions wash over me, disgust, sorrow, a lingering trace of the love I had carried for 15 years, and beneath it all, a cold, hard layer of absolute fury. She had looked at me with those same gray eyes for over a decade, promising fidelity and partnership, while secretly giving herself to another man in cheap, rented rooms. I stepped into her line of sight, and her eyes flicked up to meet mine. She didn't smile. The warmth that had once defined her expression had been completely replaced by a guarded, defensive mask. I did not say a word as I approached the mahogany coffee table that stood between us. Slowly, deliberately, I reached into my jacket, pulled out the thick manila folder, and tossed it onto the polished wood surface. It landed with a heavy, dull thud that seemed to echo in the quiet room. Sarah flinched slightly at the sound, her eyes dropping to the unmarked cardboard. She frowned, her eyebrows knitting together in a display of mild irritation that she used to deflect whenever she felt challenged. She asked me what it was, her voice flat and laced with a defensive edge. I didn't answer. I simply gestured toward the folder, my face a mask of cold neutrality, waiting for her to take the bait. She hesitated for a moment, setting her mug down on a coaster with a small, sharp click. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached out and flipped the cover open. The first photograph was a crystal-clear shot of her and Marcus walking hand-in-hand out of a boutique hotel in Philadelphia, their faces illuminated by the bright afternoon sun, both of them laughing at some shared joke. I watched her eyes widen as she took in the image. She quickly flipped to the next page, which showed them embracing in a parking garage, their lips pressed together in a passionate, desperate kiss. Page after page, the evidence unfolded before her, photos of them entering the dingy motel Marcus kept for their trysts, detailed logs of her credit card expenses on days she claimed to be working late, and finally, the printed still frames from the hidden camera Clara's investigator had installed. The color drained from Sarah's face so fast it was terrifying. Her skin took on a sickly, translucent gray hue, and her lips parted slightly as she struggled to find her breath. She looked up at me, her eyes darting wildly around the room as if searching for an escape route, before settling back on the photos. She tried to close the folder, her hands shaking so violently that she ended up scattering several of the glossy prints across the table. She began to speak, her voice high and cracked, stammering that it wasn't what it looked like, that she could explain, that it was a mistake. She accused me of spying on her, of invading her privacy, her voice rising in pitch as she tried to turn her guilt into anger. She stood up, wrapping her cardigan tightly around herself as if it could protect her from the truth, and demanded to know how I had obtained the photos. I stepped closer, my voice dropping to a quiet, lethal whisper that cut through her rising hysteria. I told her to sit down, but she refused, standing her ground with a fragile, trembling defiance. I looked her directly in the eyes and told her that I knew everything. I told her I knew about Marcus, I knew about the secret meetings, and I knew about the child she was carrying. I watched her gasp, her hand flying to her mouth as her eyes flared with a new, deeper level of panic. I added that I also knew about the doctor's appointment she had scheduled for 11 o'clock the following morning at the women's clinic on the other side of town, where she planned to quietly erase the evidence of her betrayal before I could ever find out. She collapsed back onto the sofa, her knees giving out beneath her. The tears finally came, spilling over her pale cheeks in a silent, desperate stream. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with heavy, pathetic sobs. She began to plead with me, her voice muffled by her fingers, begging me to think of the children, begging me not to ruin our family over a temporary lapse in judgment. She claimed she had been lonely, that I had been distant, trying to weave a narrative where she was the victim of my neglect rather than the architect of her own downfall. She said the pregnancy was a mistake, a horrible accident, and that she was going to fix it so we could go back to the way things were before. She spoke of our 15 years together as if they were a shield that could protect her from the consequences of her actions. I listened to her cry for what felt like an eternity, feeling absolutely nothing but a profound, hollow detachment. When she finally paused to catch her breath, looking up at me with red, swollen eyes, hoping to see some sign of softening or forgiveness, I reached into my pocket. I pulled my hand out and held it over the coffee table, opening my palm to reveal the tiny, silver sewing needle resting against my skin. I placed it gently on top of the photograph of her and Marcus, right in the center of the table. She stared at the small piece of metal, her brow furrowing in confusion, unable to comprehend why I was showing her a common household item in the middle of our marriage's execution. I leaned down, placing my hands on the edge of the table so my face was only inches from hers. In a calm, measured tone, I explained exactly what the needle was for. I told her about the night I had driven to her hotel, about finding the box of ultra-thin condoms in her makeup bag, and how I had sat in the quiet room, systematically puncturing every single one of them through the foil packaging. I told her that she had gone through nearly 50 of them over the past 2 months, completely unaware that she was actively bypassing the protection she relied on to keep her secret safe. I watched her face as the realization slowly dawned on her, the confusion turning into a look of sheer, unadulterated horror that was more satisfying than anything I had ever experienced in my entire life. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of the rain lashing against the glass. Then, a raw, animalistic scream tore from her throat. She stood up, knocking the coffee table aside, sending the mug of tea shattering onto the carpet and scattering the photographs of her betrayal everywhere. She called me a monster, a sick, twisted psychopath who had violated her body and her trust in the most disgusting way imaginable. She was hysterical, her voice cracking as she shrieked that what I had done was criminal, that I had no right to interfere with her life, that I had trapped her. She looked at me with a hatred so pure it was almost physical, her hands clenching into fists as she sobbed, her entire body shaking with a mixture of rage and terror. I stood perfectly still, watching her unravel, feeling a cold sense of completion. I told her that she had started this war the moment she let another man into our bed, and that I had simply ensured she would have to face the full reality of her choices. She didn't listen. She grabbed her car keys from the counter, her movements frantic and clumsy, and ran toward the front door. She threw it open, letting in a gust of cold, wet wind and the loud roar of the storm, before slamming it shut behind her. I heard her car engine roar to life in the driveway, the tires spinning on the wet asphalt as she sped away into the pouring rain, driving straight toward the only person she had left. I was left standing alone in the quiet, ruined living room, surrounded by the shattered pieces of my marriage, believing with every fiber of my being that I had finally won my freedom and my revenge. Chapter 4. The silence that settled over the house after the front door slammed shut was heavier than the storm outside. For several minutes, I did not move. I stood in the center of the living room, my chest heaving, listening to the fading roar of Sarah's engine as she tore down our quiet suburban street. The wind had blown a spray of cold rain through the open doorway before she left, and the dampness clung to the hardwood floor, glistening under the dim light of the chandelier. Slowly, the adrenaline that had kept my heart hammering against my ribs began to recede, leaving behind a strange, hollow quiet. I looked down at my feet. The mahogany coffee table was skewed on its side. The mug of herbal tea had shattered against the brass hearth of the fireplace, sending a dark, steaming puddle of chamomile and mint soaking into the cream-colored carpet. Scattered across the wet fabric were the glossy photographs of my wife's betrayal, her smiling face looking up at me through the spilled liquid. I knelt down on the damp carpet and began to clean up the mess. I picked up the broken pieces of ceramic one by one, careful not to cut my fingers, though a part of me felt so numb that I doubted I would have felt the pain if I had. Every photograph I retrieved felt like a trophy of a war I had finally won. I looked at the images of Sarah and Marcus, and for the first time in months, the sight of them did not make my stomach twist with jealousy. Instead, I felt a cold, mocking sense of superiority. She had thought she was so clever, living her double life, looking down on me with her quiet arrogance while she carried on her sordid little affair. But I had unmasked her. I had forced her to look at the ugly reality of what she had done, and I had left her with a burden she could never escape. The silver sewing needle still lay on the edge of the mantel where I had placed it after she ran out. I picked it up, staring at the tiny, glittering point, before sliding it back into my pocket. It was a ridiculously small thing to have caused such a massive, devastating storm. I sat down on the sofa, the silence of the empty house pressing in on me from all sides. The grandfather clock in the hallway continued its steady, metallic ticking, marking the seconds of my new life. I pulled out my phone and dialed Clara's number. I needed to tell her that it was over, that the truth was out, and that we could finally begin the process of tearing down the lives of the two people who had betrayed us. The phone rang 4 times before she answered. Her voice was not filled with the same dark satisfaction I felt. Instead, she sounded breathless, her tone hushed and frantic. She whispered that Marcus had just returned to their house, hysterical and furious, and that Sarah had arrived only minutes later. Clara said she could hear them screaming at each other from the downstairs study, their voices muffled by the heavy wooden doors. She told me she had to go before they realized she was on the phone, and before I could ask her anything else, the line went dead. I stared at the black screen of my phone, a faint prickle of unease brushing against the back of my neck. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself that of course they were panicking. Their secret was out, their careers were in jeopardy, and the child Sarah was carrying was a ticking clock that would expose them to the entire world. I went upstairs to the master bedroom, which now felt completely alien. The scent of Sarah's expensive French perfume still lingered in the air, a sweet, floral ghost that made my jaw tighten with disgust. I stripped the sheets from the bed, throwing them into the laundry hamper, unable to bear the thought of sleeping on anything she had touched. I lay down on the bare mattress, staring up at the dark ceiling as the rain continued to lash against the windowpanes. Sleep did not come easily, but when it finally did, it was a deep, dreamless void, the first real rest I had experienced in months. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a pale, gray sky and a damp chill that hung over the neighborhood. I woke up early, my mind remarkably clear. I drove to my parents' house to pick up Maya and her brother. The drive was quiet, the streets empty save for a few school buses navigating the puddles. When I arrived, my mother looked at me with a quiet, searching concern. She had always been able to read me better than anyone else, and she knew that something had shifted. I managed to offer her a weak, reassuring smile as the kids ran out to the truck, their backpacks bouncing against their shoulders. I told them their mother had to go away for a few days to visit a friend, and that we were going to have a quiet week together. Maya looked at me, her 12-year-old eyes holding a sudden, sharp intelligence that made me realize she knew more than she was letting on. She didn't ask any questions, but she reached over and squeezed my hand as we drove back to the house. By Monday afternoon, the forced normalcy of the day began to wear thin. I spent the hours cleaning the house, scrubbing the remaining tea stains from the living room carpet, and preparing a simple dinner for the kids. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart leaped into my throat, expecting a call from Sarah's lawyer, or perhaps from Sarah herself, demanding to come get her things. But there was nothing. The silence from her side was absolute, and it began to feel less like a victory and more like a gathering shadow. I tried to call Clara again around 3 o'clock, but her phone went straight to voicemail. I left a brief message, asking her to call me back as soon as she could, but as the hours ticked by, the silence only deepened. It was just after 5 o'clock in the evening when the front doorbell rang. The sound was loud and sudden, shattering the quiet of the kitchen where I was helping Maya with her homework. I stood up, smoothing down my shirt, assuming it was Sarah coming to face me, or perhaps a courier delivering legal documents. I walked to the front door, taking a deep breath to steady my nerves, and pulled it open. It was not Sarah. Standing on our front porch were 2 uniformed police officers, their dark blue jackets glistening with the light mist that had started to fall again. Behind them stood a tall man in a charcoal gray suit, his hands clasped in front of him, his expression grim and professional. He stepped forward, pulling a gold badge from his breast pocket and holding it up for me to see. He introduced himself as Detective Miller from the local police department. He asked if I was Adam Taylor, and when I nodded, his eyes locked onto mine with a cold, unblinking intensity. He stated that he had a warrant for my arrest. I stared at him, my mind refusing to process the words. I felt a sudden, ridiculous urge to laugh. I asked him what he was talking about, telling him there must be some mistake, that I was a law-abiding citizen, a school district employee, a father. But the detective did not smile. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, unfolding it to show me the official seal of the court. He read the charges aloud, his voice flat and mechanical, but the words hit me like physical blows. He spoke of reproductive coercion, of tampering with medical devices, and of sexual assault. The world seemed to spin, the neat suburban street behind the detective blurring into a smear of gray and green. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry, my voice coming out as a raspy whisper. I told him he had it all wrong, that my wife was the one who had been cheating on me, that she was the one who had destroyed our family. The detective did not argue. He simply stepped inside the hallway, gesturing for the 2 uniformed officers to follow. One of them reached for his belt, pulling out a pair of heavy, cold steel handcuffs. From the kitchen, I heard the sound of footsteps. Maya had come out into the hallway, her younger brother hovering just behind her. She took one look at the police officers, her eyes widening in absolute terror, and began to cry. I turned to her, trying to keep my voice steady, trying to force a calm smile onto my face despite the sheer panic clawing at my chest. I told her that everything was going to be fine, that there was just a big misunderstanding that I had to go clear up with the police, and that she needed to call her grandmother right away to come watch them. The officer stepped behind me, grabbing my wrists and pulling them behind my back. The cold metal of the handcuffs snapped shut against my skin with a series of sharp, ratcheting clicks that felt incredibly loud in the quiet house. The drive to the police station was a nightmare of flashing blue lights and silent, suffocating dread. I sat in the back of the patrol car, the hard plastic seat cold beneath me, staring out the window as the familiar landmarks of my town slipped away into the darkness. The scent of the vehicle, a mixture of stale coffee, vinyl, and industrial cleaning fluid, made me feel physically ill. I kept telling myself that once I got to the station, once I explained the situation and showed them the evidence of Sarah's affair, they would see that I was the victim here. They would see that she was a manipulative liar who was simply trying to punish me for exposing her secrets. But the moment I was led into the small, windowless interrogation room, that illusion began to crumble. The room was freezing, the air conditioning blowing a steady stream of cold air directly onto the metal table and the 2 uncomfortable chairs. I sat there for what felt like hours, my hands still cuffed behind my back, staring at the scratch marks on the metal surface and the large, dark mirror on the wall that I knew was a 2-way glass. Finally, Detective Miller entered, carrying a thick manila folder that looked terrifyingly similar to the one I had tossed onto my coffee table the day before. He sat down opposite me, opening the folder and spreading several items across the table. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized them. There was the small, clear plastic baggie containing the silver sewing needle I had left on the mantel. Next to it was the box of ultra-thin condoms, each one carefully catalogued as evidence. But the most devastating piece of evidence was a small, black digital recorder. The detective looked at me, his expression neutral, almost bored, which made the situation feel infinitely more terrifying. He told me that Sarah had come to the station late Sunday night, accompanied by her attorney and her lover, Marcus. She had presented the physical evidence of the tampered condoms, but more importantly, she had provided them with an audio recording. He reached over and pressed the play button on the recorder. The sound of my own voice filled the small room, sounding tinny and distorted, but horribly clear. I listened in mounting horror as my voice from the previous afternoon echoed off the concrete walls, calmly explaining to Sarah how I had driven to her hotel, how I had found her makeup bag, and how I had systematically poked holes in every single condom she owned. I heard her hysterical screams, her accusations, and my own cold, unyielding responses. She had started a voice memo recording on her phone before she ever stepped foot inside the house, capturing my entire confession with perfect clarity. I tried to explain. I leaned forward, the metal chair scraping loudly against the floor, and told the detective about the affair. I told him about the months of suspicion, about the hotel room, about Clara, and about the fact that Sarah was pregnant with another man's child. I told him that she was a liar, a cheat, and that she had destroyed our 15-year marriage without a single shred of remorse. Detective Miller listened to my rant without interrupting, his face completely devoid of sympathy. When I finally ran out of breath, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. He told me that her infidelity was a civil matter, something to be discussed in a divorce court, and that the police had no jurisdiction over who she chose to sleep with. But my actions, he explained, were a criminal matter. By tampering with her birth control without her knowledge or consent, I had committed a severe violation of her bodily autonomy. In the eyes of the law, it was a form of sexual assault, a felony offense that carried a significant prison sentence. I sat back in my chair, the cold reality of my situation settling over me like a heavy, suffocating weight. The triumph I had felt just 24 hours ago was completely gone, replaced by a paralyzing, icy terror. I asked to make a phone call, my voice barely a whisper. The detective nodded, signaling the officer outside the door to uncuff one of my hands so I could use the desk phone. I dialed Clara's number again, my fingers shaking so badly I could barely press the buttons. I prayed that she would answer, that she would tell me she had a lawyer, that she would help me show the court what Sarah and Marcus had done. But the phone simply rang and rang, eventually going to the same sterile voicemail message. I realized then, with a sickening certainty, that Clara had cut me loose. She was protecting her own family, her own assets, and she was not going to destroy her life to save mine. I was completely, utterly alone, trapped in the very net I had spent weeks weaving for my wife. Chapter 5. The holding cell at the precinct was a windowless box of painted cinder blocks, smelling of industrial disinfectant, sour sweat, and the cold metal of the bench I was forced to sit on for 12 agonizing hours. The overhead fluorescent light buzzed with a high, irritating frequency that seemed to vibrate directly inside my skull, ensuring that sleep remained entirely out of reach. My wrists, free of the handcuffs now, were red and swollen, the skin chafed from the tight grip of the steel. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the ratcheting sound of those cuffs, followed by the memory of Maya's terrified face as she watched her father being led out of our home in the damp darkness of Monday evening. The humiliation was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest until I could barely draw a full breath. I kept telling myself that this was a temporary nightmare, a bureaucratic mistake that would be cleared up the moment a sensible judge looked at the facts. I was the victim here. I was the husband who had been betrayed, lied to, and made a fool of for months. Surely, the law would see through Sarah's desperate attempt to deflect from her own sins. But the arrival of my defense attorney, a sharp-faced man named Thomas Vance whom my parents had frantically hired at 3 o'clock in the morning, shattered whatever fragile hope I had left. We sat in a small, cramped visitation room separated by a scratched plexiglass barrier. Thomas did not look at me with sympathy, his eyes were cold, calculating, and deeply concerned. He opened his leather briefcase with a series of sharp metallic clicks and spread out the charging documents. He explained, in a voice entirely devoid of emotion, that the state of New Jersey took a remarkably severe stance on what was legally defined as reproductive coercion. By systematically tampering with Sarah's birth control, by puncturing those condoms with a sewing needle, I had committed a felony. He told me that in the eyes of the modern legal system, this was not viewed as a clever act of domestic revenge or a justifiable response to infidelity. It was classified as a form of sexual assault, a deliberate violation of her bodily autonomy that carried a potential sentence of up to 5 years in a state penitentiary. I stared at him through the scratched glass, my mouth opening and closing as I tried to find the words to protest. I asked him about the affair. I asked him about Marcus, about the secret hotel rooms, about the financial deception, and about the child that was currently growing inside my wife, a child that was undeniably the result of her betrayal. Thomas simply shook his head, his expression grim. He told me that under the law, Sarah's infidelity was a civil matter, a private grievance to be argued in a divorce court. It did not, under any circumstances, provide a legal defense or justification for a physical crime. The court would treat the two issues as entirely separate. He then brought up the digital voice recording Sarah had captured on her phone. He told me that my detailed, calm confession, recorded in our own kitchen as I stood over her with the needle, was legally devastating. It was a complete, unambiguous admission of guilt, captured on tape and authenticated by the police. In the weeks that followed my arraignment, as I walked the streets on a hefty bail that had drained my parents' retirement savings, I tried desperately to reach Clara. She was my only ally, the only other person who knew the depth of the pain that had driven me to such extremes. I called her phone dozens of times, leaving long, rambling messages begging her to speak to my lawyer, to testify about the affair, to help me show the jury the monstrous behavior of our spouses. But my calls went unanswered, and my emails remained unread. It was not until the pre-trial depositions began in the middle of October, some 2 months after my arrest, that I finally saw her again. Clara sat at the end of a long conference table in her lawyer's office, dressed in a flawless charcoal suit, her dark hair pulled back in a severe, professional bun. She looked at me as if I were a stranger, her eyes holding a cold, detached neutrality that chilled me to the bone. When my attorney questioned her about our secret meetings, about the private investigator's photos, and about our shared plan to expose Sarah and Marcus, Clara's voice remained perfectly calm and steady. She admitted that we had met to discuss our spouse's affair, but she completely denied any knowledge of my plan to sabotage the condoms. She testified, under oath, that she had been horrified when she learned of my actions. She claimed that I had manipulated her grief to gain access to her investigator's evidence, and she described my behavior as disgusting, dangerous, and entirely unhinged. I wanted to scream at her, to jump across the table and shake her until she admitted the truth, but Thomas Vance held me back, his hand gripping my shoulder with warning force. After the deposition, as we walked out into the chilly autumn air, Thomas explained the brutal reality of Clara's betrayal. She was in the middle of her own high-stakes divorce from Marcus, fighting for sole custody of their children and the lion's share of their considerable assets. If she were seen as an accomplice to my criminal conspiracy, Marcus's lawyers would have used it to paint her as unstable and malicious, destroying her chances in court. She had sacrificed me to save herself, cutting our alliance without a single shred of hesitation or remorse. I was completely on my own, facing a system that seemed designed to punish me while protecting the woman who had ruined my life. The trial began in the 3rd week of November, a time when the trees in Cherry Hill were bare and the gray winter wind rattled the tall windows of the county courthouse. The courtroom was a grand, intimidating space of dark oak paneling and heavy leather benches, smelling of old paper, damp coats, and the quiet, suffocating tension of legal combat. I sat at the defense table, dressed in a stiff, uncomfortable gray suit that felt like a shroud, watching the jury take their seats. They were 12 ordinary citizens, 6 men and 6 women, who looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and quiet disapproval. To them, I was not a betrayed husband, I was a man accused of a bizarre, intimate crime against his own wife. The prosecution's case was short, precise, and devastatingly effective. They called the police officers who had arrested me, who testified about the calm, unrepentant manner in which I had behaved. They presented the physical evidence, the silver sewing needle, the box of punctured condoms, and the medical records from the women's clinic confirming Sarah's pregnancy. But the true climax of their case came when Sarah herself took the stand. She walked to the witness box slowly, dressed in a conservative, dark navy dress that made her look fragile, pale, and deeply vulnerable. Her blonde hair was styled neatly, and she carried herself with a quiet, tragic dignity that immediately won the sympathy of everyone in the room. When the prosecutor asked her to describe the moment she discovered what I had done, she began to cry. It was not the hysterical, angry screaming I had witnessed in our living room, but a soft, heartbreaking sob that echoed through the quiet courtroom. She described the feeling of absolute violation, of realizing that the man she had trusted for 15 years, the father of her children, had secretly manipulated her body and her future to satisfy a sick, vengeful grudge. She did not deny the affair when my attorney cross-examined her, but she framed it as the desperate mistake of a lonely, neglected woman who had been trapped in a cold, emotionally abusive marriage. She made the jury believe that her relationship with Marcus was a symptom of my cruelty, rather than the cause of our downfall. She painted the pregnancy not as a consequence of her infidelity, but as a forced medical condition that I had violently inflicted upon her through my act of sabotage. As I watched her on the stand, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue while the jurors nodded in quiet sympathy, I realized with a sickening certainty that the truth did not matter here. The narrative had been set, and I was the villain of the story. My own testimony did nothing to save me. When I took the stand, trying to explain the months of agony, the sleepless nights, the gut-wrenching suspicion, and the sheer, blinding rage of discovering her betrayal, my voice sounded angry, harsh, and defensive in comparison to her quiet grief. The prosecutor tore me to pieces on cross-examination, repeatedly forcing me to admit that I had planned the sabotage weeks in advance, that I had carried the needle in my pocket, and that I had watched her on a hidden camera feed without her knowledge. They made me look like a calculating, obsessive predator who had treated his wife like a piece of property to be controlled and punished. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours on Friday afternoon. When they returned to the courtroom, the silence was so thick I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock, a sound that reminded me of the grandfather clock in my hallway. I stood beside Thomas Vance, my hands clenched into fists at my sides, as the foreperson read the verdict. Guilty on all counts. The sentencing took place 2 weeks later, on a cold, bleak morning in early December. The judge, a stern, gray-haired woman named Margaret Sterling, looked down at me from her high bench with an expression of profound distaste. Before she pronounced my fate, she delivered a blistering lecture that felt like a physical lashing. She told me that my actions represented a terrifying, archaic belief that a husband had the right to control his wife's body as a form of punishment. She stated that my quiet revenge was a cowardly, malicious act that deserved the full weight of the law's severity. She sentenced me to 5 years in the state penitentiary, with no possibility of parole for the first 2 years. Furthermore, due to the nature of the conviction, she granted Sarah's emergency petition for sole physical and legal custody of Maya and her brother, stripping me of my parental rights and ordering that I have no contact with them until they reached the age of majority. I was also ordered to pay a massive financial settlement that would require the immediate sale of our family home, with the proceeds going entirely to Sarah to support the children, and the unborn baby she was carrying. As the court officers stepped forward to cuff my wrists once again, I looked back toward the gallery one last time. Sitting in the second row, dressed in a beautiful cashmere coat, was Sarah. She was not crying anymore. She sat next to Marcus, his hand resting possessively over hers, her face a mask of quiet, smug triumph. She looked at me as the guards pulled me toward the side door, her gray eyes cold and victorious, completely untouched by the ruin she had created. I had wanted a brutal, absolute revenge that would leave her with nothing, but as the heavy steel door clicked shut behind me, leaving me in the dark hallway of my new reality, I realized that my vengeance had only succeeded in locking the handcuffs around my own wrists, leaving her to inherit the world I had built. Chapter 6. The transition from the sterile, oak-paneled courtroom to the intake facility of the state penitentiary was a slow, degrading descent that stripped away the last remaining fragments of my identity. I remember the weight of the heavy iron chains clanking against my ankles as I was ushered onto the transport bus, the cold metal biting through my socks in the damp chill of that December morning. The bus smelled of diesel exhaust, wet wool, and the collective, silent despair of the 10 other men sitting around me, each of us staring blankly out the barred windows as the familiar Jersey landscape faded into a blur of gray highways and concrete barriers. When we arrived at the maximum security facility, the world became a series of harsh, metallic sounds and barked commands. I was ordered to strip, to stand shivering on the cold concrete floor while guards inspected my body with detached, clinical efficiency. My civilian clothes, the gray suit my parents had bought for the trial, were folded and placed into a plastic bin, replaced by a coarse, oversized orange jumpsuit that smelled of cheap laundry detergent and old sweat. They took my wedding ring, which I had kept in my pocket since the arrest, and slid it into a manila envelope, sealing away the last physical token of my 15 years of marriage. I was no longer Adam Taylor, the dedicated school district employee and father of 2, I was merely a number, a set of digits stamped onto a plastic wristband that I was forbidden to remove. The cell they assigned me was a narrow, windowless vault of painted cinder blocks, measuring barely 6 feet by 8 feet. It contained a rusted metal bunk bed with a thin, plastic-covered mattress, a stainless steel toilet and sink combination, and a small, bolted-down stool. The air was thick with the smell of floor wax, bleach, and the faint, copper tang of old plumbing. The overhead light, encased in a heavy wire cage, remained on for 20 hours a day, casting a pale, sickly yellow glow over the damp walls. For the first several months, the sheer noise of the prison was a constant, physical assault on my senses. The heavy steel doors slammed shut with a deafening, echoing crash that vibrated through my teeth, and the nights were filled with the distant, echoing shouts of angry men, the rhythmic pacing of guards on the tier, and the low, desperate sobbing of inmates who had finally broken under the pressure. I lay on my thin mattress, staring at the water stains on the concrete ceiling, counting the seconds of my 5-year sentence as they ticked away with agonizing slowness. While I sat in that gray cell, the outside world did not stop spinning, and the legal system continued to dismantle my life with terrifying speed. Because of my criminal conviction, the civil courts treated me not as a husband going through a difficult divorce, but as a violent felon who had forfeited all rights to his family and his property. Sarah's attorney, a ruthless man whose fees were paid out of our frozen joint accounts, filed a motion for the immediate, forced sale of our family home. I remember sitting in the prison visitor room, my hands trembling as I read the legal documents my father had brought me. The court had awarded Sarah the entirety of my share of the home's equity as a form of compensatory damages for the reproductive coercion, leaving me with absolutely nothing from the 15 years of hard work I had poured into that property. Every dollar I had saved, every renovation I had completed with my own hands, was legally stripped from me and handed over to the woman who had betrayed me. But the financial ruin was nothing compared to the loss of my children. The judge's order was absolute. I was stripped of all parental rights, and a permanent restraining order was placed on me, forbidding any contact with Maya or her younger brother until they reached the age of 18. My parents tried to visit them, to bring them gifts and keep my memory alive, but Sarah blocked every attempt, threatening them with legal action if they ever approached the children again. I spent hours in my cell, staring at the small, creased photograph of Maya and her brother that I had managed to keep in my Bible, wondering what Sarah was telling them about me. Did she tell them their father was a monster? Did she show them the newspaper articles about my arrest, using my conviction to erase the memory of the loving, gentle father who had tucked them into bed every night of their lives? The thought of my children growing up to hate me, believing that I had abandoned them or that I was a dangerous predator, was a pain so intense it felt like a physical blade twisting in my chest. I also had plenty of time to reflect on Clara's betrayal. In the quiet hours of the night, when the prison finally fell into a tense, uneasy silence, I would picture her sitting in her elegant living room, completely untouched by the devastation she had helped create. She had used me as a shield, encouraging me to gather the evidence and execute my revenge, only to cut me loose the moment her own interests were threatened. She had lied under oath, painting me as a manic, obsessed instigator to protect her own divorce settlement. She had walked away with Marcus's assets, her reputation intact, while I was left to rot in a cell. I realized then that in the game of betrayal, there are no true allies, only people who are temporarily running in the same direction until it becomes more profitable to trip you and run ahead. My anger toward her was a dull, heavy ache, but it was nothing compared to the burning, unresolved fury I felt toward Sarah and Marcus. The second year of my sentence was the hardest. The initial shock of incarceration had worn off, replaced by a mind-numbing, gray routine that threatened to erase my sanity. I worked in the prison laundry, spending 8 hours a day lifting heavy, steaming bags of wet sheets and uniforms, my hands calloused and raw from the harsh industrial soap. It was a mindless, exhausting labor, but I welcomed it because it kept me from thinking, if only for a few hours. I watched the seasons change through the narrow, barred window at the end of the corridor, the bright green of summer fading into the brittle brown of autumn, followed by the silent, white blankets of snow that covered the razor wire on the perimeter fence. I became a ghost, moving through the yard and the mess hall without speaking, keeping my eyes on the floor to avoid the violence that constantly simmered beneath the surface of the prison population. It was during the second winter, in the middle of a bitter, freezing January, that I received the letter that would finally destroy the last remnants of my spirit. It came in a plain white envelope, postmarked from Cherry Hill, with no return address. Inside was a short, handwritten note from Arthur, our old next-door neighbor who had always been a quiet, decent man. He wrote that he had been thinking about me, and though he knew he shouldn't be sending it, he felt that I deserved to know the truth of what was happening back at the house. Folded inside the note was a page torn from the local community newspaper, the small weekly publication that focused on neighborhood events, real estate transfers, and family announcements. I sat on my bunk, my back pressed against the cold cinder block wall, and unfolded the newsprint. My eyes locked onto a large, high-resolution photograph in the center of the page, and for a moment, my heart stopped beating. The caption above the photo read, "Local family welcomes new addition in blended paradise." The photograph had been taken on a bright, sunny day in late spring, right in front of my old house. The front porch, the very porch where the 2 police officers had snapped the handcuffs around my wrists, had been freshly painted a clean, bright white. The rose bushes I had spent years planting and pruning along the brick walkway were in full, beautiful bloom, their red petals vibrant against the green lawn. Standing in the center of the frame was Sarah, looking more radiant and beautiful than I had ever seen her. Her blonde hair was longer now, falling in soft waves over her shoulders, and she wore a simple, elegant white sundress that highlighted her glowing skin. She was smiling directly at the camera, an expression of absolute, serene happiness on her face. Standing right beside her, with his arm wrapped tightly and possessively around her waist, was Marcus. He was dressed in a casual linen shirt, his strong jawline clean-shaven, his expensive watch catching the bright sunlight. He looked like a man who had won the lottery, his posture exuding a quiet, smug confidence that made my stomach churn with a familiar, violent sickness. In Sarah's arms, wrapped in a soft, light blue blanket, was a newborn baby. The child was tiny, its eyes closed in peaceful sleep, its small hand clutching at the fabric of Sarah's dress. It was the child I had indirectly created when I took that silver sewing needle and punctured the condoms in her makeup bag. My act of quiet, desperate sabotage had not ruined her life, it had given her the ultimate anchor, the perfect piece of evidence she needed to bind Marcus to her forever. But the most painful part of the photograph lay in the background. Standing slightly to the side, looking subdued and awkward in their formal clothes, were Maya and her brother. They looked older, their faces thinner and more guarded than I remembered. Maya was staring at the camera with a neutral, empty expression, her 12-year-old innocence completely gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful reservation. Marcus had his other hand resting on my son's shoulder, a gesture of paternal authority that made me want to scream until my throat tore open. They were living in the home I had built, walking on the hardwood floors I had installed, sleeping under the roof I had paid for, and raising my children with my hard-earned money. Marcus had stepped directly into my shoes, inheriting my family, my house, and my life, while I was locked away in a concrete box, forgotten by the world. I stared at the photograph for hours, the paper trembling in my hands until the edges began to tear. The irony of my situation was a suffocating, physical weight. I had driven 2 hours to that Marriott hotel in Baltimore with a heart full of righteous anger, determined to expose the truth and reclaim my dignity. I had believed that my clever, silent revenge would be the final, devastating blow that would bring Sarah to her knees and force her to face the consequences of her hypocrisy. But the cold, harsh reality was that my anger had been my own undoing. I had let my fury blind me to the rules of the world, playing right into her hands and providing her with the perfect weapon to destroy me. She had used my crime to paint herself as the ultimate victim, securing the sympathy of the court, the custody of my children, and the financial settlement that ruined my family. My vengeance had not been a victory, it had been a self-inflicted wound that had cost me absolutely everything. I folded the newspaper clipping slowly, smoothing out the creases with my thumb, before sliding it into the pages of my Bible. I lay back down on the thin mattress, staring up at the yellow light bulb in its wire cage, listening to the distant, metallic clanging of the prison gates. There would be no dramatic escape, no sudden reversal of fortune, and no final, satisfying moment of justice. I was going to spend the next 3 years of my life in this gray cell, waking up to the sound of barked commands and falling asleep to the echoes of desperate men. And when I was finally released, I would emerge into a world where I had no home, no career, and no family, while the woman who had betrayed me continued to live her perfect, sunlit life in the paradise I had built for her. As the rain began to fall against the high, barred window at the end of the tier, I closed my eyes, finally accepting the brutal, unjust truth of my existence. In the end, the price of my vengeance was not paid by the guilty, it was paid entirely by me, in the cold, silent currency of my own stolen life.